Hi, and welcome to the Property Development Derisked podcast, where we talk all things pre-construction and help you with our experts to keep your projects on track. So in this episode today, we're going to be talking everything specialist housing. What is it? Why is it important? And how do we make these projects viable? So our guest today is Paul. Hi, Paul. Welcome.
Hi, Gonzalo.
Paul Smith. How are you doing? And just for everyone else, Paul is a well-known and respected figure in the local government and housing sector. He is the Group Chief Executive of Elim Housing, and previously he's had many leadership roles, including Cabinet Member for Housing at Bristol City Council, which is where we met, wasn't it, Paul? That a long time ago.
That's right, yeah. Back in the day.
Back in the day. I feel like we divide our time now between post-pandemic and pre-pandemic time frames. So yeah, that seems like a little while ago. But yeah, welcome, Paul.
Yeah.
I was going to say, feel free to first of all expand on that bio and just share with the audience kind of your background and essentially what you've been working on and how you got there.
So I've actually got a degree in astrophysics and a teaching qualification. So they're not things that necessarily suggest a career in housing. Although I've worked in housing now since 1989. I don't want to add up the numbers, too long ago. But I first became really actively involved. I've been involved peripherally in housing. I mean, I grew up on a big council estate. I became a council tenant. I've been a shared owner. I'm an owner-occupier now. But my first real involvement was around issues of youth homelessness, which I got involved with in the youth council in the early 1980s in South Bristol. And then when I came back from university, my first job was as a youth worker and got involved in setting up a youth homelessness organisation. And I think that's what drew me into the housing industry as a career.
Yeah. And why do you think that was? So you just finished your studies in astrophysics, and then the housing sector and the youth homelessness lured you into that. What was social purpose? What was it that drove you?
Yeah, but I mean, it's also because I've known people who'd experienced homelessness, but with the astrophysics, of course, you've always got the famous Oscar Wilde quote that all of us are in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. Well, I was looking at the stars, but looking at the gutter as well. So that it was quite an interesting introduction to the way that the housing world works. We started off as a group of people who wanted to do something. We managed, actually, from a small association, they gave us a donation which allowed us to buy our first property in South Bristol. And then once we had one, we were able to then negotiate with other housing associations to manage properties that they owned. And ultimately, that organisation merged with a similar organisation based in East Bristol to become what is now 1625 Independent People, which is the biggest homelessness agency in the city.
Amazing.
So it's quite a great thing to look back on. But I've worked for the National Housing Federation a couple of times. I've worked for a few housing associations. I headed up the sector's skills business at one period, done some charity based work as well. And of course, local government. So I was a councillor from 1988 to 1999, sat most of that time on the housing committee of the council, and then came back onto the Bristol Council in 2016 as the Cabinet Member for Housing until I took up this job at Elim in 2020.
Yeah, excellent. And Bristol City Council are quite well known in the local government space for what they've done in terms of housing and obviously the work with the Bristol Housing Festival, the work on all the small sites, the big aspirations and housing targets, and the big direct delivery program.
Yeah.
Which a lot of that was things that you brought in at your time there, and obviously now Gorham Homes, which is the council's arm's length development company?
I mean, I was really lucky. I came into the role with a lot of experience in the sector, but also a lot of contacts.
Yeah.
I mean, the housing sector is a bit of a village. I think you've probably realised that now in your own work. And I could draw on expertise from people from all across my career history. And in fact, the housing association I worked at previously was, like many others, was not working in Bristol because it was too difficult to get anything done. And so I went in, very much with a mission to turn that around from Bristol being a basket case to it being almost like an incubator of, not just building more housing, but also experimenting. So Bristol Housing Festival was one of those in terms of off-site manufacture and taking advantages of new technology to bring schemes forward.
And loads of pilot programs have gone through that, which have then got wider adoption across other kind of local authorities across the UK.
Yeah, and then Elim Homes was the housing company that we set up, and that's now got a pipeline, I think, of somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 homes to build in the city. But it's, again, not just about the numbers. It's about building high quality homes with, good environmental sustainability indicators, and also high levels of social housing, which will then go over to the council's housing department. And so we wanted Elim Homes to be able to show, by working in joint venture with private developers, that within the city of Bristol, you could both turn a profit and meet the council's planning requirements, which was often the challenge that we got from developers saying, we can't afford to build affordable housing, or we can't afford to build net carbon zero housing.
It's not viable. We can't do that. Yeah.
So part of developing Elim Homes was to do it, but also to show that it could be done.
Yeah. I've seen that a lot. The fight with viability consultants from private sector and public sector. But yeah, excellent. And in terms of your kind of your background, do you feel kind of what you were saying earlier was because you were feeling it and you were there as the Oscar Wilde quote in the gutter, that kind of got you to kind of focus on the sector much more and want to be part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, growing up on a big council estate, it seemed like that housing dictated so many things. It dictated what sort of people you lived with, what the quality of your environment was. It dictated, whether you had a home that could be heated. So housing to me seemed like a very logical area to move into once I started getting involved in it, because it was both the solution to a lot of problems and actually caused a lot of problems as well, and wanted to see how we could, various ways ensure that, people did have somewhere, of good quality that they could afford to live in. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. It's always key to have those missions. And it's funny, you kind of know my story, but me and my wife previously, we living in London, we lived in a boat for 4 years and on the Regent's Canal, which was part of kind of that journey just to try and save up for the housing sector. And you mentioned shared ownership. We then bought a shared ownership home from a housing association, which we really liked, and kind of stepping it up from there. But and that's kind of what inspired me to start RenKap and help unlock land for more homes, was the fact that I was frustrated and a little bit pissed off, I would say, with the housing sector and what was being delivered at the time.
And in somewhere like Bristol, it's really difficult because every site has got an issue. The reason it's not been developed is because there's an issue there. And in Bristol, you've got obviously issues of contamination, issues of access, issues of archaeology, issues of how a new building fits in with the other buildings around it, issues of urban cramming about, you need to retain a level of green space in cities to ensure that they're livable. So there's huge barriers to actually building in cities. You can see why major developers are attracted to buying agricultural fields, because usually they've got very few of those problems. And it's very easy to build at pace and at quite high volumes. But we really need more people, with access to the services that living in the city provides. And of course, if you build a lot of housing outside the cities, what you create is a transport problem as well. And it's hard enough to get around cities as it is at the moment.
Yeah. And I completely understand that some of these smaller sites have bigger risks associated to them. But I would also say, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, is it also a capacity constraint for, let's say, local authority to deliver smaller sites? Because if you've got a team of, let's say, property professionals, you want them to focus on the bigger sites, which are more efficient for their time, rather than working on a smaller site. Because it doesn't matter if you're delivering 50 homes or 10 homes, the planning process will take similar amount of time and similar amount of resource from your team.
I think you're absolutely right. If you're trying to drive numbers to make a big difference quickly, then you're going to say, well, where are the biggest sites? Where are the biggest opportunities? Which makes sense, but also misses the opportunity that can be gained from smaller sites. But as you quite rightly say, the cost of de-risking the site and preparing the site can be quite out of proportion to the value you get from the homes that you build. And so you see, large numbers of housing associations not looking at small sites. My association specialises in small sites. You find that local authorities are also not that interested in small sites, because if they've been given a target to build X hundred or X thousand homes, you say, well, there's a site here that can deliver 3. It's like, well, show me the site that can deliver 300.
Yeah.
So that capacity issue cannot be overestimated, in my opinion.
Yeah, excellent, and that's a big one that we always kind of talk about on the podcast. And another one is also private sector, because over the last 20, 30 years, SMEs have reduced in the market, and we've got lots of larger and larger house builders who are asking for bigger sites, and their business models work on the bigger sites. So even if actually trying to procure a small site, like for example here in London, trying to procure a site that's maybe less than 10 million is actually quite hard to do. Whereas the larger sites are easier because the big players are kind of in that space and willing to take those on, and sometimes the smaller ones have those challenges as well.
I think we've seen, every time there's a recession, the number of smaller house builders and developers just drops away quite significantly. And, one site going wrong can tip them over the edge, whereas for the major house builders, they can spread that risk across the whole of their portfolio. So, you can see that for smaller organizations, they're operating on the edge really of viability all the time.
Yeah.
Because if a site's significantly delayed or a site falls over, say through the planning process, then the abortive costs could be enough to kill off the organisation.
And there's something interesting there actually, which is if we want to support small house builders, but as you mentioned, these smaller sites are the ones that typically have a lot of kind of constraints against them, then there's something there to be done to support the smaller builders to actually have access to that information. Because sometimes if land is disposed of and sold, sometimes the large house builders can take a chance on a site. They might realize, there's a problem here, and they'll cover it from their profits elsewhere. But as you say, smaller house builders can't take those chances, and it makes it quite difficult.
Absolutely. And if they're relying on, say, a project a year to come through, or a project every 2 years to come through, and they lose one, then, they're often quite heavily cash flow businesses, I think it can really affect them. And I guess, with interest rates rising now, that's going to become even more difficult for many of them, because they'll be covering a lot of that initial cost, certainly pre-planning with debt.
Yeah. I like what the GLA is doing with their small sites program. So they help all the borrowers to try and unlock their sites, support them to do all the de-risking of it, and provide all the reports beforehand, before they put it on the market, so that when you buy it, you know what the risks are. I think that's an interesting way of trying to support the smaller house builders to de-risk themselves before they commit to buying a site, which is quite interesting. But so a moment ago, you mentioned Elim Housing, so your housing association, Paul, and let's get onto that. So you're doing loads of great work on specialist housing. And if you could share with the audience, what is specialist housing and why is it important?
Yeah, I mean, first to say, I think one of the things about Elim, we're quite a small housing association. We've got just over 900 properties at the moment. We only do small scale development, so we don't look at anything that's more than 15 homes. In the southwest, we're the biggest, probably in the whole of England, actually the biggest housing association provider of Gypsy and traveller sites. We provide a lot of supported accommodation for people who've experienced homelessness. But one of the areas that we've more recently moved into is the provision of specialist housing, which is housing for people who would otherwise be effectively trapped in hospital because they've got severe learning disabilities. So across England, there are 2,000 people who are in hospital with learning disabilities who do not need to be in hospital. What they need is their own home. And the NHS is desperately trying to deal with this problem, because obviously it creates huge costs for the National Health Service. Local authorities are very keen to deal with this problem because it creates costs for their adult social care budgets, because at the moment, most of those people end up being placed in private sector accommodation, which is extremely expensive, or left in hospital, which is also both expensive and inappropriate. Actually can make people's care needs greater by sort of keeping them in an institution.
So that you're saying they're getting potentially worse.
Yes, it's detrimental to their sort of well-being. And there have been numerous examples of people coming out of hospital and then the level of support they need reducing because they've moved into a home and they feel more comfortable and less stressed in terms of their environment, which has a positive impact generally on their health.
Yeah.
So we've got involved initially in a program called Transforming Care, which was an NHS program, which was created following the scandal uncovered at Widsbourne View by Panorama, which showed that in some of these facilities, people with learning disabilities were being quite significantly abused by the people who were supposed to be caring for them. So the first scheme that we got involved with was a scheme in just outside of Bristol in South Gloucestershire. It's a scheme with 6 bungalows, all specifically designed around the needs of the person who's likely to be moving in, plus a block for the carers, and including some overnight sleep-in accommodation, so that there's 24-hour care on the site. I have to say that went surprisingly well through the planning system. Strong support from the local parish council, even though it's actually technically on a greenfield site. Strong support from local residents, very strong support from the South Gloucestershire Council themselves. So we've now secured planning permission on this development. We've now signed off all of the planning conditions, and we should be going out to tender soon for people to build that scheme out. We're working on another scheme of the same size in Bristol, again, 6 bungalows. This one is not being funded by anybody. So what we're doing is something where we will borrow 100% of the cost of building the scheme. It's on a piece of land that's currently owned by a charity. We're buying half of the charity's land so that they can invest the money from the land sale into their services. And on that other half, we'll build 6 bungalows and facilities for carers. And all of the money for that we will borrow on the market from our lenders. And then we have an arrangement with the council that the level of rent we charge, which is effectively funded by central government through housing benefit, will cover the fact that we've got no grant, so that we've got higher borrowing costs for the scheme.
So you're saying the rent is slightly higher for that reason?
Yes, it will be higher.
Yeah.
And then we've just purchased a bungalow in Bristol, 3-bedroom bungalow, which is going to be converted for one woman who's been in hospital for 16 years.
16 years.
So she'll move into this bungalow. There'll also be a room overnight so that a carer can sleep overnight. It's 3-bedroom bungalow. And again, we're doing that completely with borrowing money and then paying back that borrowing through the rent. We're doing another scheme in Gloucestershire of 2 bungalows that are being converted that are next door to each other. And in that scheme, 75% of the cost is coming from the NHS. And then we've got another scheme in Bristol, which is 12 homes, which is being part funded by Homes England, part funded by the council. And that allows us to keep the rents at an affordable level. But all of these projects are for people who otherwise would be trapped in very expensive and completely inappropriate institutionalized hospital care. I mean, we need hospitals, if we have a trauma of some kind, we need to go in. But once that trauma's fixed, we expect to come out. We don't expect it then to become where we live for the rest of our life.
No, 16 years is crazy amount of time.
And most of these people are quite young. They're sort of in their 20s and 30s. Okay. And the idea that they might be kept in, if something isn't provided for them, they could end up in hospital for 40 years is, just an appalling proposition, really. And it's not what the NHS is for. So the issue is finding these sites. They're all quite small sites, about half an acre, that can then be made available to develop this very specialist accommodation so that those people can live, the same sort of life that we do in our own homes with our own front door, our own sort of sense of peace and security. But of course, they'll have 24-hour care in addition to that.
Yeah, and that's obviously those are the requirements of what you're building there, which you'll have to incorporate for having people to look after them. But the key question here, is you kind of touched on it, is how do you make these schemes viable? And what was interesting from your answers a moment ago is every scheme you had kind of a different funder or different grant. There isn't it seems like there isn't a program, or is it because it's not as advanced as some of the other kind of affordable housing programs?
I think the Transforming Care program was a national program which had over £100 million in it. I think that program has now come to an end. Different health areas will have a slightly different approach to how they might fund these schemes. And there may be, you never know, the government might come up with a new capital program for it. But at the moment, what we have to do is find, for each scheme, we have to look at a way of funding it to make it work. As a small association, we've got a limited amount of borrowing capacity. So we also have to look at the balance between schemes which are funded and schemes which are unfunded to make sure that, we've got the capacity to deliver those schemes alongside, we're developing other general housing schemes for people on the council's waiting lists and registers, and we're also developing more sites for gypsy travellers. So we have to make sure that we balance our portfolio of lending. We can only lend so much.
Yeah.
You usually find that lenders, for instance, won't lend to associations more than 50p for every pound worth of asset they hold. And you also have to be able to demonstrate that you're making enough surplus each year to pay off the interest and more, so that the banks and the lenders aren't putting their money's not at risk.
Just for our audience, the surplus in a housing association, that's essentially your revenue, or is it the profit?
So surplus is the profit that you make, but in a housing association, the profit is retained within the business and reinvested in your services. What we do have shareholders. They pay £1 and then they never get any money back. We don't have owners. We are owned by our charitable constitution. So any money that we make has to go back into our business.
Yeah, excellent. So there's in terms of being able to, the viability for these sites. So, as you say, some of them you balance it where you can actually borrow against your assets that you've got. Others you might have to get the borrowing elsewhere from Homes England, NHS, or wherever, whatever sources might support it.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. And is it, obviously the NHS has a huge program where they're trying to dispose of some land for housing, and there's a big aspiration from department from levelling up communities and housing. That seems like a great fit if they're trying to kind of release some public sector land for housing, specifically with the NHS. Supporting them with specialist housing might be, or for it to be a key package of that, would be kind of a good fit.
It's interesting because none of the land we've got is actually NHS land. So if I think about the sites that we're using for new build, one of them is owned by Bristol City Council, one of them is owned by a charity, and the other one is privately owned. So there's no national government land in there from the NHS or from any other part. It might be different for other organisations in other parts of the country, but we, as an organisation, we're looking for small sites that we can take forward, and we'll talk to churches that have surplus land. We'll talk to local authorities. We'll look at buying lands privately. One of the ways we help make schemes viable is that we have our own private development arm at Elim. What we do is we look at building sites out with 2, 3, 4 houses on in a joint venture with a small SME developer, and then we share the profit at the end. Their profit obviously goes into their company. Our profit is gifted to Elim as a charity to help us meet our charitable objectives. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Before we move on from this section, is there anything else on specialist housing that I haven't asked or that you'd like to share with the audience?
I think the thing to say is that because it has to be designed very differently to our normal housing. So, for instance, you can't have any points. You can't have corners because people could injure themselves on them. The spec is so specific that you're probably talking about 15% a square foot more than developing a standard property. So it is expensive to develop, which is another thing which drives the level of rent you have to charge for these types of property.
And the fact that you also have a unit or a complex on the development for the care worker, is that revenue, is that something that's being built that you can't rent out?
So we have to provide it free to whoever the care provider is, because we're talking about, builders as organisations with very tiny margins and high risk. the same's true of care organisations. So part of the deal with the health service is, and the local authorities, is that accommodation that we build is provided rent free to the care agencies. Yeah. I think the other thing is that we also have to be we have to be really careful about how we choose the sites. So, for instance, you don't want any overlooking into gardens. Now, sometimes you can deal with that with screening, but if it can be at the bottom of the hill, for instance, where people can look down into it because of the issues that some of the residents will have. It can't be too noisy a location, but also you don't want it to be too quiet a location. It needs to have good access to things like GP surgeries. It also has to be somewhere where there's a workforce to provide the care. You don't want to stick it out in the middle of nowhere in the countryside and find that you can't recruit anybody to work there because nobody lives near there, and the low pay that you get in the care sector means they can't afford to commute there. So there's quite a lot of considerations over and above the ones that would normally come into a land search. Yeah, interesting. It'd be worthwhile for there to be some sort of guide for any housing associations or development entities that want to kind of work with specialist housing, because those are kind of the insights that you wouldn't get if you were doing it for the first time. Understanding those parameters. And interesting, the fact that you had to give let's say the elements of the development that's for the care worker for free, obviously hits viability because you're building more that you can't rent out. Mm-hmm. So your rental area compared to the total area is less than a typical traditional building. Yeah, which is why a lot of these schemes have been built with 100% grant.
Yeah, right.
Because, I mean, if we look at the scheme that we're building in South Gloucestershire, when we initially, things have moved on now, but when we initially had it valued, the cost of building it was about 2.5 million. The book value of it was about 1.2 million. So it doesn't actually stack up because it's actually built at a deficit. So that deficit has to be covered through grants. Yeah. Or through the ability to be able to charge, much higher rents through the housing benefit system. Because that gap in value has to be subsidised in some way.
Yeah, and that's why, I guess,
very different approach to viability than you normally see.
It is, but it's a much more long-term and holistic approach, because you spend £1, let's say, building that instead of £3 in the future trying to house them in the private sector or in the NHS.
Keeping them in hospital, yeah.
Yeah.
And we know the huge pressure there is on hospital beds at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. And then, as you know, Paul, I like to ask one key question at the end of kind of our podcast, which is regarding abortive costs on developments. Yeah. One of the views that we have at RenKap is that there's so much abortive costs in the construction industry. And what we mean by that for the listeners is essentially cost that gets spent on a development, typically the pre-construction stage, which for some reason something gets found out and we need to go back to the drawing board and spend that money again. And I feel like it happens all the time in my background when I worked in the industry. And we always like to ask different guests that come on board if they have any experiences of those abortive costs and what they may be.
Yeah, well, of course we do. I think, anybody in development will have schemes that for whatever reason haven't worked out. I mean, we brought in a new head of development about 2.5 years ago, and she said unfortunately when the first thing she had to do was switch off some of our projects because when she looked into them they weren't viable, and all the architect's fees, the planning fees, and the surveyor fees, and the land search, and the contamination, all of those disappear. We've had one recently where we were hoping to build a couple of houses. We thought everything was fine in terms of planning, and then we've hit against a conservation issue about a view that was blocked by part of the building. And so we'd spent money on architects, on sort of, land inspections, everything else. And we sort of battled along with it, tried to, with our architects to change the design of that scheme so that view that was protected was still available. And in the end, I think we've, thrown up our hands and sort of given up and said, we now need to design something completely different for that site to get around this conservation issue. And so all of those original costs, particularly the architecture, design costs, have all been completely abortive. And we've had to go back literally to the drawing board. No, they're not drawing boards anymore, are they? They're CAD systems and the like.
Do you have any kind of a view on what that potential abortive cost is in terms of a value?
I think some of my colleagues might know. I don't know off the top of my head, but I think it's thousands, around tens of thousands. But it's also, well over a year that's lost. So some of the abortive costs are sort of intangible. It's like, what would you have got from selling the properties that you were originally going to build compared to the ones that you might be building now? The housing market would have shifted. We're talking about house prices dropping by 10%, so they could be coming out when values are lower. And so you've got the real abortive costs, which are the fees, but then you've got that opportunity cost that you've lost as well. And so I suspect that whenever anybody does a calculation of their abortive costs, the real cost is greater. Just because of the lost time, in terms of actually producing something, but also the lost, the additional time where you've carried a debt on your books because you've had to cover the costs of something that's not going to be repaid, the cost of your own internal time that often is not factored in properly. And the blood, sweat, and tears and the stress never seems to have a proper cost related to it. But in Bristol, conservation rightly is a significant issue in terms of what are the things that could lead to a scheme having to be remodelled or delayed or stopped altogether. Because, what's seen as not being in fitting or it's blocking a view of something that from a particular angle that you haven't considered. The problems are not always in the land. They can sometimes be above the land.
Exactly. And in that example, how would you have overcome that at an earlier stage before spending that money?
I think we probably should have engaged with the conservation officers much earlier, but of course there's capacity for those people in local authorities in terms of they tend to only deal with schemes when they've actually, come forward as a planning application, finding it more and more difficult to get pre-app advice, particularly on small projects. But I think what's classed as a small project in terms of pre-app planning support is becoming more, the bar is being raised all the time because of capacity within planning departments. I'm sure if we'd used your tool, it would have identified things for us and,
Well, I'd hope so. Paul. But that was really interesting insight in terms of the hidden abortive costs. And one of the points you mentioned was that opportunity cost. Potentially the market has shifted. All of a sudden it's moved on and now you need to redesign it, and the cost for materials are way higher than they used to be. And the values are going down. So values are going down and prices are going up, those are as well some of the elements that fall into it. And those pesky abortive costs are plaguing the industry. But look, amazing. Thank you so much for your time and your insights on the show, Paul. We really, really appreciate it. If let's say one of our guests wanted to get in touch, what's the best way to follow you or get in touch, whatever it might be?
I usually say the best thing to do is to find me on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Which I think I can be found by typing Housing Paul into LinkedIn as one word. But
Housing Paul, perfect.
There obviously aren't many Paul Smiths on LinkedIn. But they can look up you and look for the people you're linked with called Paul Smith, and they
I'm sure they'll find you because you're very active on LinkedIn.
Yeah. And then, I mean, the other thing, obviously, go to the Elim website and find me through that.
Cool.
Can just say it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me today.
Yeah, awesome. You're welcome. And thank you for listening, and look forward to speaking to you and the audience next week.